Hi, I'm Suzanne Henney. I'm the editor of Streetwise magazine, and I'm here today with Emily Roiswig, who is the executive director of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and I'm going to show you our edition, which is on the Chicago Cultural Alliance and their event Inherit Chicago. And the reason I'm wearing my scarf today is the Chicago Scots. I'm a member. This is my grandmother's clan or tribal tartan, and they are a member of the Chicago Cultural Alliance, and I was thrilled to find that out when I read about them. The Chicago Cultural Alliance is, let me see, 30 cultural centers? No, 41 cultural centers, okay? And some of them have to do with when people came over. The Chicago Scots is the oldest nonprofit in the state. They go back to 1845. People were coming over here. They were poor. They needed help. And one of the stories that really touched me about the organization, there was a man who came over here in the 1920s. He managed to bring his teenage daughter and his wife over. He got cancer and he died. They couldn't afford to bury him. And so the Chicago Scots, which was the Illinois St. Andrews Society, they buried him. They had graves at Rose Hill Cemetery. And 20, 30 years later, made me cry. The daughter wrote a letter saying, "Thank you very much. We couldn't afford this, and here's a donation." So this is kind of the line, like, we all didn't come over on the same ship, but we're all in the same boat. Kind of cheesy, but it's kind of sweet, you know? So the reason, Emily, we talked about this when we did, again, the overhead on the whole point of this is we talk about immigration, but this brings it front and center. These are organizations that sometimes they're still helping people, sometimes they're about cultural preservation, sometimes they're about helping the senior citizens do better, sometimes they're about preserving for the next generation, but they're definitely authentic and first voice. So tell me a little bit more. Let's talk about Inherit Chicago.
Yeah.
It is starting with Dumpling Fest this weekend at Navy Pier.
Yes, and the Chicago Cultural Alliance, we're an organization that have our roots at the Field Museum.
Okay.
So we began with Dr. Ala Kawali and Dr. Rosa Cabrera bringing together 15 culturally specific museums, first voice organizations, together to just have conversations and to start dialogue. And that grew into the Chicago Cultural Alliance, which formed formally in 2008. And we've been growing ever since, representing both immigrant and native cultural heritage museums, centers, and historical societies throughout the Chicago region. We're really one of a kind in many ways. There are some organizations in California and the Southwest that do some of this type of work, but we really are the only one in the Midwest that is really focused on helping cultural institutions improve their capacity, promote cultural heritage, and spark intercultural dialogue. So we started Inherit Chicago as a way to platform cultural heritage centers in the region. We realized that while many people in Chicago may have known some of the cultural heritage institutions, they didn't necessarily frequent the centers a lot. So we really wanted to create an opportunity to open the doors up wide to Chicagoans to come in and experience cultural heritage, whether it's your own or different from you, and have some conversations with people maybe you wouldn't normally.
Okay. So let me think. And one of the things I joked with you about is I don't think there's anything like this anywhere in the U.S. And many of these organizations have national in their name. So I'm like, okay, now, Emily, this sounds to me like a Chicago version. Chicagoans lately have turned into Texans a lot. It's like, we are the biggest, we are the best. But tell me about some of these organizations that have national in their name. Like the National Hellenic Museum, I know, has more oral histories and Greek objects than anywhere else. And National Cambodian Killing Fields is commemorating the genocide of the 1970s. And who else? Now, what else is there?
Yeah, we have a number of national cultural museums in Chicago. National Hellenic Museum is Greek, obviously in Greektown, and as you said, they do have the largest collection outside of Greece in the U.S. For objects and oral histories, collection items. The National Cambodian Museum really became prolific across the United States for their work memorializing the killing fields with the Khmer Rouge. And National Indo-American Museum recently took on the national title and is really in an effort. They have a space that's opening up in a couple years in Lombard, but as they create that space for themselves, they really are a kind of floating museum around Chicago, hosting events and inciting dialogue around the Indian experience in the United States.
Okay, all right. So let's get back to Inherit Chicago, and then we'll hand off to a couple other people. So Inherit Chicago and Dumpling Fest, we'll start with Dumpling Fest.
Okay.
So explain Dumpling Fest. What
Yes.
are the dumplings?
Yes. So Inherit Chicago was, I want to talk a little bit about the name before we jump into World Dumpling Fest. It's really about, you said it best when you started talking about your heritage as a Scots woman. Is that correct? Usage?
So, yeah.
Okay, great. We all have something we've inherited, and we all have family traditions. And this festival is really about not just platforming cultural heritage centers, but getting Chicagoans to think about what they've inherited from either their family or the community that surround them, and also understand that we create together the culture of Chicago, and that we can more actively participate in what that looks like.
Okay.
And make sure we're a welcoming city for immigrants and Native people. Make sure that we're inclusive and equitable throughout the city.
Okay.
So this offers a little bit of that, and World Dumpling Fest is a great example of that because arguably every culture has a dumpling.
Okay.
We define dumpling as a dough stuffed with a certain kind of filling, either fried or steamed or have whatever you have. And that can be a samosa, that could be, your traditional pot sticker or your sambusa from Ethiopia.
It could be a pierogi.
Yes.
And it could be from Ukraine also. They
Yes.
have a variation. Vareniki, they're called?
Vareniki, yes.
All right,
And
all right.
Chocolat Cafe and Pastry is generously participating in the festival this year from Ukrainian Village.
Okay.
So we're excited to have them.
Okay.
As well as 19 other restaurants that all represent different cultures.
But they're all a meat, cheese, veggie filled doughy stuffing.
Yes, and sometimes vegan, sometimes gluten-free. So
Okay.
we're very inclusive of dietary restrictions as
And what you
well.
also said to me before is every culture has experiences. We all have weddings, and in China, we have just different ways of expressing it. In China, it's going to be a red dress for good luck, but in the United States, it'll be white. So, but it's still weddings. So we all have these variations. We just do things a little differently, and that's what we're highlighting in here at Chicago.
Yeah, we are, especially with World Dumpling Fest, we're highlighting that, right? We all
Let's
have an encased fried dough stuffed in with something, arguably, and we can discuss that. But it's all about understanding the commonalities as well as the differences.
So were there any, we're gonna let you talk about a couple of events, I believe, and then
Oh, yeah,
we're gonna
sure.
talk with with the gentlemen too. So what events are you trying to highlight right now among the month-long schedule?
So it was very hard to choose two events.
Okay.
But a couple events I'm excited about are one is an exhibit
Okay.
which we have coming up, and this was a collaboration between the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture and the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art.
Okay.
They both reside on the west side of Chicago, and they're coming together to have a modern art exhibit that's called Forgotten Forms.
Okay.
And it highlights two artists from each of their communities, all talking about how cultural heritage manifests itself in a city
Okay.
or in a place.
Okay.
Edra Soto does a great job of talking about how the Puerto Rican traditions can take place in architecture in a city through her artwork.
Okay.
And it's going to be a really fantastic exhibit. It goes up in October and goes until December, but the opening event happens as part of Inherit Chicago.
And what day is that?
That's a good question. Let me open up our calendar here. That's October 11th
Okay.
is the opening.
All right. All right.
And that's a very exciting event.
And this is exciting. Again, we have Puerto Rican and Ukrainian.
Yeah.
They don't live, the neighborhoods are not that far apart on the west side, but they're collaborating to say, here's what we have in common. So these are things we don't think about in Chicago, but we need to be thinking about as Chicagoans and as Americans.
Exactly.
And it's an example Chicago is doing for the world. We are being that. Okay.
And these cultural heritage centers and museums are really leading in that.
Okay.
This is the second collaboration between the Ukrainian Institute and the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture, and I just see that dialogue and that collaboration continuing.
And then you had one other event you wanted to mention?
Yeah, so an exciting event that's happening at the Swedish American Museum. So the Swedish American Museum and the DuSable Museum of African American History are collaborating for a Jamaican photographer called Darrell Creighton. And he is a Chicagoan that traveled to Sweden many years ago, and through his travels in Sweden was offered amazing opportunities that usually weren't afforded to him back here in the city, and took photographs of Jimi Hendrix, the Supremes, many amazing performances, as well as some Black Panther meetings in Sweden, which I didn't even know were happening there. And he's just an amazing history. And he then came back to Chicago after that work and opened up the first photography gallery in Chicago that was owned by an African-American man in the city. So we're really excited to highlight his history and some of his photographs with this program. And that takes place actually pretty soon, on October 6th at the Swedish American Museum.
So again, this is the Swedish American Museum in Andersonville collaborating with the DuSable Museum in Washington Park. So we're, it's neighborhoods way apart, it's cultures way apart, but you know what? There was something similar because he got his big break in Sweden.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's flash the overall thing on here so that people can have the listing, and then I think I need to talk with one of the other gentlemen. So we're going to do the overhead. No, we're going to do the zoom. There, I'm going to zoom it right here so you can see. Here's the website. It's September 29th to October 26th, Citywide Cultural Festival, inheritchicago.org. And I'll talk to Larry. I'm going to talk to you first, okay? So this is, and you are Ruben, right?
Yes,
And we
Ruben
talk-
Salazar
Ruben-
from Philippine American Historical Society.
So let's
Chicago.
also show the book. I think it's fascinating. You wanted to tell me about several events. Should we talk about, we've got like about 5 minutes for each of you. So tell me, we're talking about Larry Itliong first, or we want to talk about the other event?
Let's start with the Larry Itliong.
Okay, so I'm going to show you this book, and I think this is fascinating because, again, Larry Itliong was actually the founder of the United Farm Workers Union. And what's not really well known about him is that in the 60s, the grape growers in Delano, California were on strike. But they were Filipino workers. Larry Itliong came over at 15 from the Philippines. They were 60 years old. They were nearing the end of their work thing, and it was time to pass the baton. But he was on strike, and so that's when he went to Cesar Chavez and said,
That's correct.
I need an alliance.
So it is a collaboration between the Filipino Americans and the Mexican Americans, who are both farm workers in Delano, California, that brought about the start of the United Farm Workers. And they were quite successful because it put two communities together that are both having the same issues.
That's right.
And so it was wonderful. And it's appropriate that October happens to be both Filipino American History Month and the tail end of the Hispanic Heritage Month.
That's right.
So it's a good partnership, collaboration to bring about this event. So,
But these were people who were farm workers, and they weren't getting paid well. And again, the Filipinos were 60 years old. It was time to say we need some people who are 20 years old and in here. So it was an alliance. As they say, we're always better, stronger together.
that's correct.
Okay. So what's the other event you want to? And I should also point to the cover again of the magazine. This is a lady from your organization.
This
She's
is
one of
ac-
your dancers.
This is actually Gabi Telson,
Okay.
who has performed at the World Dumpling Fest last year.
Okay.
And she's coming back again this year, performing Filipino cultural dances.
Cool, all right. All right, so now, what's the other event you wanted to tell me about?
The other event that I was going to talk to you about is the Indigenous Dance Celebration,
Okay, and what day is that?
and that's on October 19.
Okay, tell us about
And
that.
just like a lot of the other events happening in Inherit Chicago, it's a collaboration this time of 4 ethnic communities.
Okay, which
These
ones?
are the Japanese,
Okay,
the Filipinos,
okay,
the Maori, and the Aztec. So
Wow.
they're all featuring indigenous dances
Okay.
and telling the culture and the heritage of all these 4 communities.
wow, wow.
And this is happening at the Trickster Art Gallery out in Schaumburg.
In Schaumburg, okay, so the Trickster Art Gallery is 190 South Roselle, Schaumburg, okay, all right.
That's correct. So we're actually focusing not just in Chicago, but also in the suburbs, in the
So
greater
it's
Chicago
Metro,
area.
Chicago, it's
Yes,
Metro
exactly.
Chicago, all right. All right, so I'm gonna put the Zoom over here. I'm gonna zoom right in, there it is. That is the Indigenous Dance Celebration at the Trickster Gallery, and there we go. So it's the Trickster Gallery, learn about traditional dances and accompanying regalia. I think somebody pointed out to me that is the proper term. So it's dancers from the Philippines, Japanese, Aztec, and Maori communities. I didn't know there was much of a Maori, that's New Zealand community
Yes,
here.
that's correct.
Wow,
Yes.
okay. And the audience will be invited to participate. That's fabulous.
Yes, there would be interactive dancing to get
Cool.
the audience participate.
Really, how fun is that? That's great. That's really fun. So what other things does the Philippine cultural, what's the exact name of your organization again?
It's the Filipino American Historical Society of Chicago.
Okay,
And October also happened to be the Filipino American History Month.
okay,
Not very many people know about it, but we do have events also focusing on Filipino American history. And this year, we're celebrating and honoring what we call the Pinay visionaries, or the Filipino American women that are actually the backbone of our community.
cool. All right, and Filipinos have been coming here since when?
We actually started back in the 1700s, so
Oh,
it's
wow.
more than 3 centuries.
Wow.
But we came in 4 generations, or 4 phases.
Okay.
And the latest one actually came in the 60s, and that's where most of the people from Chicago came, mostly professionals,
Okay.
working in the hospitals, working in the postal workers,
Okay.
as well as teachers.
Okay. All right, well, let me put this on again, and I'm going to do another handoff, because we have one more guest we have to get on. So here's the Zoom, and here is, again, Inherit Chicago, and there it is, September 26th to October 29th, inheritchicago.org. So now, I am meeting,
Rafael Núñez
Okay.
from the Dominican American Midwest Association.
okay, now tell me why Dominicans came here. It started basically with the overthrow of a dictator in the Dominican Republic, and people started coming over.
Yes.
And
yes.
many of them were professionals, and you went into all different kinds of organizations, different
Yes.
kinds of businesses.
Well, yes, then many of the Dominicans that first arrived here, were actually engaged in professional works, and medical, medicine, dentistry, and those professions. But that later in the 1980s and the 1990s, then we had a variety of Dominicans of different sorts, that began working in meatpacking industries and then the garment industries.
Okay.
And it became more diversified, more workers-oriented as the group grew in Chicago. Now we have a whole host of individuals that own shops, hairstylists, repair shops, mechanics, and so on.
So probably the gamut, like everybody else.
Yes.
So let's talk about your 2 events. You have one event, Classical Music Meets Latin Rhythms.
Yes.
And this is, I'm just going to let you keep talking, and I'll say it is October 18th and it's 7:30 to 9, and it's in Oak Park. So it's the Dominican American Midwest Association, the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance, and it's a fusion of Latin rhythms. So the artist is Dominican and Pakistani. She's a violinist.
She's a violinist.
And she's coming to Chicago specifically for this event. Her name is Aisha Syed Castro.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So tell me more about this event.
This is a wonderful event because it includes, actually two nationalities.
Okay.
Or three nationalities. She is Dominican, Pakistani, and then she's accompanied by a pianist who is Polish. That his name is Martin Labasevich,
Okay.
who's also a very well-known pianist here.
Okay.
And they're going to be performing a fusions of classical music, and then Latin rhythms.
Okay.
Pieces by Dominican composer Rafael Solano.
Okay.
And then by Carlos Gardel, Astor Piazzolla, and then the Spaniards, Enrique Granados, and even the pieces by an African-American, William Grant Still, who's considered the deans of the African-American composers in this country, and I believe was probably the first African-American who had a opera produced by the New York City Opera.
Wow, the
Yes.
Metropolitan Opera.
Yes.
Fabulous. So that's one event, and I think you had another event you wanted to talk about.
Yes, there are actually two of them because the first one is going to be on the 17th.
Okay.
And that's going to be a collaboration with the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance.
Okay.
In which we're going to be providing a workshop
Okay.
for underserved students about violin because Aisha would like to do that.
So the
And
lady who's doing the concert on the 18th is doing a workshop the day before.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And the way she puts it is that she would like to democratize
Violin.
the violin. She'd like to bring it to the people so the people can learn, from a professional like she is, and then enjoy, the idea that you can actually accomplish much through music as she has done.
That's fabulous.
Yes.
So are there any other events that you have, that you're promoting?
Yes, and definitely so.
Okay.
In addition to the performance, with the music performance, that night, the first part of the event, we're going to be recognizing prominent Dominicans in Chicago. This time we're going to be promoting, actually talking and recognizing the Consul General of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Giselle Castillo Beremis, for her outstanding contribution here to the Dominican community and to all the Latino communities as well that she has done. In addition to that, we're going to be presenting some scholarships for students of Dominican descent that have been selected by two professors or three professors from the University of Illinois in Chicago.
Fabulous.
And that they are receiving what we call the Dr. Ramon Garcia Educational Award. Now, we normally do that every year.
Okay. So we have about a minute left, and I think I'll just keep talking. We'll find things to talk about until they tell us that we're not on. So, tell me something heartwarming that happened at an event in your organization, something that you never would have thought of before, just some memory like that for you.
Well, the fact, that I was able to partake and be part of the conversation with the very well-known writer, Junot Diaz,
Okay.
who is one of the Latino writers of this country, that won a Pulitzer Prize Award
Really?
with his stories, Drowned,
Okay.
and then The Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. That's his novel that he wrote. Has been very successful, and I thought this man was very lofty and above the earth. And then I realized that he was just one of a kind, and one individual that you can talk to and have fun with.
Wow, that's interesting. Until they tell us, I'm going to mention a few more that intrigued me. I was intrigued here by October 10th, repatriation of cultural patrimony. This is at the Hellenic Museum, and it's going to involve the Chinese American Museum, the Ethiopian Community, the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian, and the National Hellenic Museum. So they're basically talking about Canada, China, Greece, and Ethiopia. you may be familiar, Athens, for example, is the home of the Acropolis. In maybe the 1800s, the British took a number of sculptures from the Acropolis and brought them back to the British Museum. And of course, these are the original, these go back to the Greek gods, the stories of how, I think, Athena was born. The sun came up, the sun god took the chariot across, and then he descended. But some of these statues were toppled, and so they've been in the British Museum, and the Greeks have been asking for them to come back. Simultaneously, some of these other cultures, the Native American cultures, the Native Canadian cultures, these are bones of ancestors, and and maybe there's pottery involved in the tomb, and people are like, well, this is anthropology, and yes, that's very nice, but these are somebody's family as well. So all of these cultures have this in common. They want it back. It may be nice in a museum somewhere else, but they want it back because it's their heart.
Yes,
And I think that's what we're talking about too. This is your heart.
that's my heart.
It's your heart. And so it's how do we preserve what you're feeling and also pass it on. You pass it on to your children, but you also want the Chicago community to know this, and maybe the tourists as well.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So what else can we be talking about? Let me see. Let me run down some of them. I'm going to we've talked about, I'm going to give you a little synopsis. So we have Voices of the World is October 5th. That's going to be at the Open Center of the Arts on 2214 South Sacramento Avenue. This is in collaboration with the public schools, and it's called The Voices of the World. It showcases 51 artists from 48 countries, and it's posters that interpret "We are all migrants." So you're going to be able to look at those posters and then tour Little Village, which is right around where our studio is today. And this is free admission. We've mentioned Cambodian Music, Life and Healing is going to be October 6th, 20th, and 27th. It'll be at the Chicago Cultural Center, at the National Cambodian Heritage Museum, which is on West Lawrence Avenue, and then in Skokie. I mentioned October 10th, the Cultural Patrimony, which is Greek, Native American, Native Canadian, etc. And then we've mentioned the Filipino American History. It's October 11th and 12th. It'll be at Hull House and at the Budlawn branch of the Chicago Public Library. And we mentioned Forgotten Forms on October 11th, which at the Ukrainian Institute of Modern Art. That's the collaboration with the Puerto Rican Museum. And so we have 1 minute left. October 12th is going to be Cricket Mela. That's an Indo-American tradition. That's going to be at Cricket Hill on Lakeshore Drive. And October 12th also is interesting how the Chinese Americans built the railroad and ate healthy in the meantime. I mean, they came over from China. They built the railroad from California to Promontory Point in Utah. They met the railroad people coming from the east, and this is how they cooperated. So we've also got the Youth Fine Art Music Competition. This is the Assyrians. The Assyrians came here when it was no longer comfortable to be in Iraq. So I'm going to again put the overhead on for a second, or the Zoom. This is the event again, Inherit Chicago. And I'm going to, I guess I can bring you all back and just kind of let you get in the background for me one time. And we'll just, as we sign off, it's Inherit Chicago. It's September 29th to October 26th. And we're happy to have you. We're welcoming you to pick up this edition of Streetwise and read all about it. I'm going to do this one because it's folded down. And there we go. And this is, again, the Chicago Cultural Alliance, Inherit Chicago. And there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.